The 2006 Everest climbing season became the most controversial ever. The ethics of commercial mountaineering hit headlines around the world. Climbers were accused of putting their own ambitions above the lives of fellow mountaineers. A record 500 climbers summited Everest. Some died trying.
For anyone to climb Mount Everest requires a superhuman effort. 90% of the people who set off to climb Everest never discover how hard it is because they turn back before then. Even when you're using oxygen, it feels like you're on a treadmill and breathing through a straw. No matter how hard you try, you just can't get enough.
In 30 years of mountaineering, Lincoln Hall has summited many of the world's great peaks, but not Everest.
Well, people are certainly drawn to Everest because it's the ultimate symbol of adventure. I mean, there's other mountains that are harder, more beautiful perhaps, but of course nothing else is higher. It just leaves everything for dead.
So in 2006, when Lincoln receives an invitation to join an expedition to the north side of Everest, he doesn't hesitate. But it's a risky proposition. At 29,000 feet, the summit of Everest has 30% of the oxygen that exists at sea level. Ascending too quickly can lead to acute mountain sickness and eventually death. Recent studies suggest that climbers over 50 are at least twice as likely to die at this height. Lincoln Hall has just turned 50. Putting his writing career on hold, he'll be leaving his wife Barbara and 2 teenage sons behind.
It is hard to explain why you would face such dangers, but I knew how dangerous it was, and I felt that the dangers were within my grasp.
Lincoln begins his journey from base camp, 18,000 feet above sea level. From here, he'll move up the glacier to advanced base camp, then up the ice slopes to Camp 1. Then he'll climb through the high camps and hopefully onto the summit. Lincoln has now spent 2 months on the mountain, acclimatizing to the low oxygen levels. This footage shows members of Lincoln's expedition. It has cost each climber $15,000 to join the 20-strong international team run by Russian Everest veteran Alex Abramov.
Today, it's a very long way, about 4 hours. From here it seems very close, but really not less than 4 hours. So people should be brave today, and I hope everybody reaches this altitude. Weather is perfect.
Climbers on Everest must also battle the weather. There's usually only a 2-week window every year that allows access to the summit. However, this year, the weather is unseasonably good, keeping the window open for much longer. More climbers make summit attempts, but the casualty rate has also been higher. Already this season, there have been 9 deaths. Just before Lincoln leaves Camp 1, news arrives of a 10th. It is Russian teammate Igor Plyushkin.
One of the Russian climbers from our team had got into some sort of difficulty. He was actually a very experienced climber, but he was having problems, and suddenly I learnt that he was dead.
Igor's death is a wake-up call for Lincoln. Igor was a similar age and also an experienced mountaineer.
That was a shock. There'd already been a number of deaths on the mountain, so already this was an expedition that I'd never experienced because there was just so much death this time round.
It is now late in the season, and very few climbers are left on the mountain. Most of Lincoln's team have already made their summit attempts, or have turned back. The only members remaining are Lincoln and German climber Thomas Weber with his guide. Climbing at their own pace, they will continue up the mountain for 3 more days, to camps 2, 3, then the summit.
Not long after the Sherpas and I left the halfway camp to head to the high camp, we came to a big flat rock. It was an obvious place to rest. There was this sort of long pile of rocks in front of us, and you could see that there was a body under there.
It is the grave of Igor Plyushkin, the Russian climber who died 2 days earlier.
Igor's death had been in my mind, of course, since it happened, and to come across his body was just a shock.
Everest has become the final resting place for around 200 climbers. Lincoln's 3 Sherpa companions, Dorje, Dawa and Lakcha, are accustomed to encountering their frozen remains.
The Sherpas don't like to move the bodies. I guess there's a part of superstition in there, but there's also a Buddhist belief that when someone dies, consciousness leaves the body over a 3-day period. So a body should be left in the one place for 3 days. And of course, nobody's going to hang around up there for 3 days, or they'll just add to the body list.
Too difficult and dangerous to retrieve, most of Everest's victims remain where they fall. 22 years ago, Lincoln came close to being a victim himself. This footage, shot in 1984, records an attempt to summit Everest by an unclimbed route up the north face of the mountain. Organized by Lincoln Hall, it was a climb that would go down in mountaineering history.
The route that we chose on the north face turned out to be very dangerous. There were a lot of avalanches.
The attempt was brave, but perilous. To find a new route without fixed ropes, Sherpa support, or oxygen.
And in the end, we were really stretched.
Lincoln's climbing partner was Greg Mortimer.
Oh yeah, it was an extraordinary, formative experience for everyone involved. We're a very close group of friends. On our appointed summit day, Lincoln wasn't feeling right, and his feet and hands, particularly his feet, were really cold, and he was worried that if he went on, he was going to get frostbitten, considerably. So he just made that, gut-wrenching decision to turn around.
They're at the summit. They're on the top.
Greg Mortimer achieved his ambition by summiting that day.
They're waving at us.
But Lincoln Hall missed his chance.
Really, it was a survival decision for me. It was probably the hardest decision I've had to make, but it was the right one.
But it's a decision Lincoln has had 22 years to think about. What makes Everest so dangerous is not its technical difficulty, but the extreme altitude. No amount of climbing experience can prepare the body for its unpredictable effects. Above 27,000 feet, human life is most at risk, which is why it is called the death zone. Still reeling from his encounter with Igor's body, Lincoln is forced to consider whether to continue.
I thought, well, this here now is the purity of mountaineering. Do I want to go on? And I actually wrote a list about why I should and why I shouldn't. I rang Barbara.
Hi everyone, it's me. I guess you're out. Happy birthday, Dylan.
I guess we'd been talking about it on and off for years. He's always carried that disappointment of not achieving his dream the first time around. So it was an opportunity to see whether he was able to do it. And there was just a message on the answering machine just reassuring us that it was optimum conditions. The weather was perfect. He was climbing strongly, climbing with oxygen, climbing with 3 Sherpas. So everything was great.
I'm feeling strong. The weather's fantastic. And we'll be leaving at midnight. I love you all. Bye for now.
It's midnight, and Lincoln Hall is at the point of no return. After 22 years, his chance to summit Everest has arrived again. After 4 days of solid climbing, he heads into the death zone, where survival depends upon speed. Only 3,000 feet below the summit, Lincoln will try to ascend and return as quickly as possible. A grueling 18-hour day.
One of the unpleasant aspects of mountaineering is the procedure of getting up in the middle of the night so that you have the whole of daylight to use for your climb. You've got this big mask in front of your face, which means you can't really see your feet very well. And you've got a headlamp on, so you've got a very narrow beam of light.
But suddenly, Lincoln comes face to face with yet another victim of Everest's brutal conditions. It is the body of British climber David Sharp.
It was quite shocking. His body was literally frozen solid.
Of the 11 deaths during this climbing season, the most famous is David Sharp. 10 days earlier, Sharp had crawled into a shallow cave. It was his third attempt to climb Everest, but his method was extremely risky.
He had a minimalist approach to climbing. He had no Sherpa support. He had no real contact with other expedition members because he didn't have a radio. When he was discovered dying, nobody even knew who he was. He was very much alone.
As many as 40 climbers walked past David Sharp as he lay dying. Concealed in the darkness, most didn't see him. Those who did see him assumed that he was resting or already dead. But David Sharp didn't die that night. Next morning, he was still alive. Now visible in the daylight, the returning climbers began to notice him.
It was a very tragic situation. Climbers coming back from the summit, the coldest night of the season, 11 cases of serious frostbite that night alone. It was the worst night of the season to be out in the elements, and that's when David Sharp was dying.
The media reacted swiftly to the news that David Sharp was left to die.
David Sharp ran into trouble on the mountain, and he is passed by a number of climbers.
40 other climbers passed by mountaineer David Sharp as he lay dying.
Has commercial mountaineering made climbing a remarkably heartless pursuit?
Criticism all the more stinging since it comes from Sir Edmund Hillary.
He was a human being, and we would regard it as our duty to get him back to safety.
The headlines reignited the debate about the ethics of mountaineering and whether or not they're being corrupted by modern commercial and personal imperatives.
David Sharp's situation was portrayed as climbers concerned only with their own ambition.
Synthesising these things in the comfort of your own lounge room can't let you understand what's taking place above 8,000 metres. It's such a fine line between getting it right and getting killed.
The reason David Sharp could not be rescued was because it was physically impossible to do so. He could not walk, and the reality of being at extreme altitude is that everything effectively weighs 4 times as much because you don't have the oxygen in your system to make your muscles work. So to be able to lift a dead body or a nearly dead body is just impossible. There was just no chance of bringing him down at all, no chance.
Lincoln and his Sherpas are making good progress. They reach the notorious second step. Shown here, it's a 150-foot vertical rock wall, the biggest obstacle on the climb. After 9 hours climbing, Lincoln and his 3 Sherpas approach the summit.
I could see the summit ahead. There were some prayer flags dangling over the very steep lip of the east face, and that was an indicator that was the summit. It was obvious that we were going to make it. There's a last little steep section to the summit, which is just how it should be, I guess. And the one last step, and I was on the top. There was no one else there. It was just an incredible privilege, I guess, to have it just to myself, the highest person on the planet.